Sometimes, the most dangerous thing a man can wear is not a mask, but a badge hiding behind arrogance. The late afternoon sun cast long orange shadows across Jefferson Avenue as traffic crawled through downtown Brookdale, Georgia. People moved quickly along the sidewalks, trying to beat the evening rush before the city disappeared into another humid southern night. Street vendors packed away their carts. Taxi horns echoed between tall office buildings. And just outside City Hall, a small crowd had already gathered around a tense scene unfolding near the corner crosswalk. Officer Daniel Hargrove stood rigid beside his patrol SUV, one hand resting near his belt as frustration darkened his face. At 38 years old, Daniel carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never once been told no. Tall, broad-shouldered, with mirrored sunglasses hiding his eyes, he scanned the sidewalk like every stranger was a threat waiting to happen. For years, people in Brookdale had whispered about him. Stories passed quietly through barber shops, church parking lots, and neighborhood diners. Stories about traffic stops that escalated for no reason. Stories about disrespect disguised as authority. But complaints against Officer Hargrove never seemed to go anywhere. Cameras malfunctioned. Reports disappeared. Witnesses suddenly changed their statements. And Daniel walked the streets every day like the city belonged to him. About 20 feet away stood a tall black man wearing a dark gray hoodie, blue jeans, and worn brown boots. Nothing about him looked flashy or important. No security detail. No expensive watch. No polished limousine waiting nearby. Just a calm man in his early 50s holding a paper coffee cup while helping a young boy gather groceries that had spilled onto the sidewalk moments earlier. His name was Isaiah Brooks. And at that moment, nobody around Daniel seemed to realize who he really was. The little boy looked terrified as apples rolled into the street. Isaiah bent down carefully, handing him a grocery bag with a reassuring smile. "You're all right, buddy," he said softly. "Take your time." But Daniel didn't see kindness. He saw suspicion. His jaw tightened as he stepped forward aggressively, boots striking the pavement with sharp authority. "Hey," he barked loudly enough to stop nearby conversations. "Step away from the kid." Now, the crowd turned instantly. Phones slowly appeared in people's hands. Isaiah remained calm as he straightened himself to full height. "Officer, I'm just helping him pick up his groceries," he replied evenly. Daniel laughed coldly. "Funny. That's not what it looked like from where I was standing." The boy tried to explain, his voice shaky. "Sir, he was helping me. I didn't ask you." Daniel snapped, cutting him off without even looking at him. The atmosphere changed immediately. You could feel it in the silence spreading across the sidewalk, in the nervous glances between strangers, in the uncomfortable tension hanging beneath the noise of the city. Isaiah slowly raised one hand, still holding the coffee cup. His expression never changed. Calm, steady, controlled. "Officer," he said carefully, "there's no problem here." But Daniel stepped closer anyway, invading his space with deliberate intimidation. "License. ID now." A woman standing nearby frowned. Another man quietly muttered, "Here we go again." Isaiah reached slowly toward his back pocket, careful not to make sudden movements. Yet even his calmness seemed to irritate Daniel more. Because men like Daniel didn't just want compliance. They wanted fear. They wanted submission. And Isaiah Brooks refused to give him either. Daniel suddenly grabbed Isaiah's wrist hard enough to spill coffee across the sidewalk. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "I said move slower," Daniel shouted. Isaiah looked directly at him, voice still controlled despite the humiliation building around them. "Officer, you're making a mistake." For a brief second, everything seemed to stop. The traffic, the noise, even the wind moving between the buildings. Then Daniel's temper exploded. In one reckless moment fueled by ego and prejudice, he shoved Isaiah backward in front of everyone watching. The coffee cup hit the pavement. The lid rolled slowly across the concrete. And somewhere in the growing crowd, a woman whispered words that would soon change everything. "Oh my God, that's Mayor Brooks." The words spread through the crowd like electricity racing down a live wire. "That is Mayor Brooks." At first, Daniel Hargrove did not react. His face stayed locked in the same irritated expression as if the sentence meant nothing to him. But the people around him reacted immediately. Several bystanders lowered their phones in shock. Others stared at Isaiah Brooks with widened eyes, suddenly recognizing the man standing in front of them. One elderly woman near the bus stop covered her mouth with trembling fingers. "Lord have mercy," she whispered softly. Daniel finally turned his head toward the woman who spoke. "What did you just say?" he demanded sharply. The woman hesitated but pointed directly at Isaiah anyway. "That is Mayor Isaiah Brooks." For the first time since the confrontation began, uncertainty flickered across Daniel's face. Small, barely visible, but there. Isaiah adjusted his hoodie calmly and wiped coffee from his sleeve without saying a word. He looked nothing like the polished politician people expected to see on television. There were no cameras following him, no expensive suit, no flashing security convoy, just a tired man standing quietly in the middle of his own city. Daniel scoffed loudly, trying to force confidence back into his voice. "Yeah, right. And I am the governor." A few nervous chuckles escaped from people standing nearby, but nobody sounded convinced anymore. Because now more faces in the crowd were beginning to recognize him. The calm eyes, the voice, the familiar face from town hall meetings, school events, and late-night interviews about police reform. Isaiah Brooks was not just another citizen. He was the mayor of Brookdale, and Officer Daniel Hargrove had just humiliated him in public. A black SUV suddenly turned the corner at the far end of Jefferson Avenue, then another behind it. The atmosphere changed instantly. City employees standing near the courthouse steps straightened nervously. A man in a navy suit stepped out of the lead vehicle before it fully stopped rolling. His expression looked pale with panic. "Mayor Brooks," he shouted while hurrying across the street. Daniel's stomach tightened immediately. The suited man ignored everyone else and walked directly toward Isaiah. "Sir, are you all right?" he asked breathlessly. Isaiah nodded once. Calm, controlled, still refusing to escalate the moment. But the silence around Daniel was becoming unbearable now. He could feel dozens of eyes fixed on him, phones recording him, judging him, waiting to see what happened next. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly. "Nobody informed me who he was," he muttered defensively. The statement landed badly, very badly, because deep down, everyone standing there understood the truth. The problem was never that Daniel did not know Isaiah was mayor. The problem was how quickly he decided a black man on the sidewalk must be dangerous in the first place. Isaiah finally looked directly at him again. His voice remained low and steady, which somehow made the moment even heavier. "Officer Hargrove," he said calmly, reading the name from the badge. "Would you have treated me differently if you knew who I was?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no answer came out. Traffic continued moving behind them. Horns echoed faintly through downtown. Somewhere above the street, an American flag snapped sharply in the warm evening wind. Yet the silence between those two men felt louder than the entire city. Isaiah glanced briefly at the frightened little boy still clutching his grocery bag near the curb. Then he looked back at Daniel. "That child watched everything you just did," Isaiah said quietly. "What exactly do you think he learned about justice today?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably as sweat gathered beneath his collar. Across the sidewalk, more city vehicles began arriving. Reporters were already rushing toward the scene after hearing police radio chatter. And standing there beneath the fading Georgia sunlight, Daniel Hargrove slowly realized the moment he thought would disappear quietly into another evening was about to become the biggest mistake of his entire career. The flashing lights from arriving city vehicles painted Jefferson Avenue in waves of blue, red, and white as the crowd continued growing along the sidewalk. Reporters pushed through pedestrians holding microphones and camera equipment, while nearby business owners stepped outside their stores to see what was happening. In less than 5 minutes, the confrontation had transformed from an ordinary street stop into something much bigger, something dangerous. Officer Daniel Hargrove stood frozen beside his patrol SUV, trying to maintain the image of authority that had protected him for years, but the ground beneath him was shifting fast. Every phone pointed toward him felt heavier now. Every whisper from the crowd sounded sharper. And across from him, Mayor Isaiah Brooks remained calm in a way that almost made the situation worse. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He did not demand revenge. He simply stood there with quiet disappointment in his eyes, and somehow that silence carried more weight than anger ever could. Deputy Chief Elena Ramirez arrived moments later, stepping quickly out of an unmarked black sedan parked near the courthouse entrance. Her expression hardened the second she recognized Isaiah, standing beside Daniel. "Mr. Mayor," she said immediately, walking toward him. "Are you hurt?" Isaiah shook his head slowly. I am all right, Chief Ramirez. But her eyes had already moved toward Daniel. The disappointment on her face was impossible to miss. Daniel straightened his posture defensively. Chief, this situation is being blown out of proportion, he said quickly. I was conducting a lawful investigation. Several people in the crowd reacted instantly. Investigation, one man shouted. He was helping a kid pick up groceries. Another woman raised her phone higher. I recorded the whole thing. Daniel's jaw tightened. He hated losing control of a situation, especially in public, especially in front of cameras. Deputy Chief Ramirez lowered her voice carefully. Officer Hargrove, she said, step away from the mayor and lower your tone. That single sentence hit Daniel harder than anything else had so far. Not because of what she said, but because of who heard it. The reporters, the crowd, the other officers arriving at the scene. For the first time in years, Daniel was no longer the man controlling the narrative. He was the story itself. Isaiah glanced quietly toward the young boy standing beside his mother near the bus stop. The child still looked shaken, clutching the grocery bag tightly against his chest. Isaiah slowly walked toward him while cameras followed every movement. You did nothing wrong today, Isaiah told the boy gently. Do you understand me? The child nodded nervously. His mother wiped tears from her eyes. Thank you, sir, she whispered. Isaiah offered her a tired smile before turning back toward the growing crowd. The evening air felt thick now, heavy with tension and emotion. Downtown Brookdale had witnessed protests before, angry speeches before, headlines before. But this moment felt different because people had watched it happen with their own eyes. There was no debate, no edited report, no missing footage, just truth standing in broad daylight. Daniel suddenly noticed several officers whispering to one another near the patrol vehicles. One of them avoided eye contact entirely. Another quietly looked away when Daniel glanced over. That was when fear finally began creeping into his chest. Real fear. Because deep down, Daniel understood something terrifying in that moment. If the city started looking closely at what happened today, they might start looking closely at everything else too. Isaiah Brooks slowly faced the cameras gathering near the courthouse steps. The flashing lights reflected against the glass windows behind him as the city noise faded beneath the tension in the air. Then, in a calm voice that carried across the entire street, he said words that made even the reporters fall silent. This is not about me. The real question is how many people without cameras have stood in this exact spot before tonight. The street outside Brookdale City Hall no longer sounded like an ordinary evening in Georgia. Police radios crackled nonstop. News helicopters circled above the skyline. Reporters lined the sidewalks shoulder to shoulder, speaking urgently into cameras while residents gathered behind metal barricades brought in by city workers. And at the center of it all stood Mayor Isaiah Brooks, calm beneath the chaos surrounding him. The flashing lights reflected across the courthouse windows like restless waves, while humid summer air pressed down over the city. Deputy Chief Elena Ramirez stayed close beside Isaiah as additional officers arrived to secure the scene, but tension was spreading fast through the department itself. Because everyone understood one thing now. This was no longer just about one officer losing his temper on the sidewalk. This had become a public spotlight on the entire Brookdale Police Department. Officer Daniel Hargrove stood several feet away near his patrol vehicle, isolated despite the crowd surrounding him. For years, he had walked these streets believing his badge placed him above accountability. But now, for the first time, nobody rushed to defend him. Several officers avoided standing too close. Others whispered quietly among themselves. One young rookie stared at the ground entirely, clearly uncomfortable with everything unfolding. Daniel could feel the shift happening around him, and it terrified him more than he wanted to admit. A reporter suddenly pushed forward through the crowd. "Mr. Mayor," she called loudly, "do you believe this incident was racially motivated?" The entire street seemed to freeze waiting for Isaiah's answer. Even the cameras stopped moving. Isaiah looked toward the reporter carefully before answering. "I believe what happened today reflects a deeper problem that many people in this city have tried to talk about for years," he said calmly. "The difference tonight is that this time, the cameras were rolling." Murmurs spread through the crowd immediately. Some people nodded quietly. Others looked emotional hearing the words spoken out loud by someone in power. Near the barricades, an older black man removed his baseball cap slowly and shook his head. "About time somebody said it," he muttered under his breath. Daniel clenched his jaw tighter. Every sentence Isaiah spoke felt like another layer of control slipping away from him. This is ridiculous, Daniel snapped suddenly, stepping forward. Everybody is acting like I committed some crime for doing my job. Deputy Chief Ramirez immediately turned toward him. Officer Hargrove, she warned firmly, enough. But Daniel was unraveling now. Years of unchecked authority had left him unable to handle public humiliation. You all know how dangerous these streets are, he continued defensively. One wrong move, and an officer ends up dead. I made a judgment call. Isaiah looked directly at him again. Not angry, not emotional, just deeply disappointed. A judgment call, Isaiah repeated quietly. Interesting choice of words. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Isaiah continued before he could speak. Because what I saw tonight was not fear. It was assumption. The silence that followed felt crushing. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang 6 times across downtown Brookdale. The sound echoed softly through the heavy evening air. Isaiah slowly walked toward the line of cameras gathered near the courthouse steps. People moved aside instinctively to let him pass. Even now, after everything that happened, he carried himself with quiet dignity that made the entire moment feel larger than politics or headlines. He stopped beneath the courthouse lights and faced the crowd fully. You want to know why I was walking alone tonight? He asked. Nobody answered. Because for months, families in this city have been telling me they are afraid. Mothers afraid for their sons. Children afraid of uniforms that are supposed to protect them. Elderly citizens afraid to report harassment because they think nobody will listen. The crowd remained completely silent now. Some people lowered their heads. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Isaiah took a slow breath before speaking again. Tonight, I wanted to see this city with my own eyes. Not from behind a desk. Not through statistics. I wanted to walk these streets as an ordinary man. He paused briefly, glancing toward Daniel, standing motionless beside the patrol SUV. And tonight, Isaiah said quietly, I learned exactly why so many people are afraid. The cameras kept rolling long after sunset settled over Brookdale. Downtown streets glowed beneath flashing patrol lights, and television vans lined the courthouse block bumper to bumper, while reporters continued broadcasting live updates across the city. What began as a single confrontation on Jefferson Avenue had now spread far beyond one sidewalk. Inside apartments, barbershops, diners, and living rooms across Georgia, people watched the footage replay again and again. A white officer grabbing a black man without cause. A crowd growing silent. And then the shocking realization that the man being humiliated was the mayor himself. But for Isaiah Brooks, the deepest pain had nothing to do with embarrassment. Standing beneath the courthouse lights, surrounded by microphones and armed officers, he looked less like a politician and more like a man carrying years of exhaustion in his eyes. Deputy Chief Elena Ramirez quietly stepped beside him again. Sir, she said carefully, we can move this inside if you would prefer. Isaiah shook his head slowly. No, he answered. People deserve to hear this. Across the barricades, more residents continued arriving by the minute. Some held handmade signs demanding accountability. Others simply stood silently watching. The air felt heavy with emotion, like the entire city had finally reached a moment nobody could ignore anymore. Near the front of the crowd stood a young black teenager wearing a grocery store uniform, still carrying his backpack from work. He stared at Isaiah with wide, uncertain eyes before finally speaking loud enough for nearby cameras to hear. Mr. Mayor, he asked nervously, if they treated you like this, what chance do regular people got? The question hit the street like thunder. Several reporters immediately turned toward the teenager. Others lowered their microphones slightly, waiting for Isaiah's response. And for a brief second, Isaiah looked unable to speak at all. Because deep down, he knew the boy was asking something much bigger than a simple question. He was asking whether justice in Brookdale depended on power, titles, and status. Whether dignity only existed for people important enough to make headlines. Isaiah slowly walked closer to the barricade separating him from the crowd. The courthouse lights reflected softly across his tired face as helicopters continued circling overhead. You should not need a title to be treated with respect, he said quietly. You should not need cameras to prove your humanity. The crowd fell completely silent again. Even Daniel Hargrove, still standing near his patrol SUV, looked shaken hearing the words spoken out loud. Isaiah glanced toward him briefly before continuing. What happened tonight is not new, Isaiah said. That is the real tragedy. The real tragedy is how many people learned to stay quiet because they believed nobody would believe them. Several older residents nodded painfully as he spoke. One woman near the back of the crowd wiped tears from her cheeks. Another man removed his glasses and lowered his head. The city was no longer watching a political scandal unfold. They were watching years of buried frustration finally surface into the open air. Daniel suddenly stepped forward again, voice strained with desperation now instead of confidence. I did not know who he was, he repeated. I treated him like any other suspect. The statement only made the silence around him worse. Because this time, nobody missed the meaning behind the words. Isaiah looked directly at him again. Calm, steady, unmoved by anger. Exactly, Isaiah replied softly. That is the problem. Those 5 words landed harder than shouting ever could. Daniel's face tightened immediately as the reality of the moment settled deeper into his chest. For years he had hidden behind procedure, reports, and authority. But now the entire city could see something he could no longer explain away. The issue was never mistaken identity. The issue was how easily suspicion came to him when the person standing in front of him was black. A warm wind swept through Jefferson Avenue as church bells echoed again across downtown Brookdale. Somewhere behind the cameras, a child's voice quietly asked his mother, "Is the mayor going to be okay?" And standing beneath the courthouse lights, Isaiah Brooks realized the answer to that question would shape far more than his own future. It would shape whether this city finally chose truth over silence. By 8:30 that night, Brookdale no longer felt like the same city. Every television inside every sports bar, apartment lobby, and corner diner replayed the footage from Jefferson Avenue on an endless loop. The same moment, the same stunned silence, the same image of Mayor Isaiah Brooks standing calmly beneath flashing police lights, while Officer Daniel Hargrove realized too late who he had publicly humiliated. Social media exploded faster than city officials could respond. Hashtags demanding accountability spread across Georgia within hours. Old stories about Daniel began surfacing online from people who had stayed silent for years. A college student posted shaky cell phone footage from a traffic stop 6 months earlier. A delivery driver shared photos of bruised wrists after what he called an unnecessary detention. A grandmother from East Brookdale uploaded a handwritten complaint letter she claimed was ignored by Internal Affairs 2 years before. One by one, voices that once felt invisible suddenly found courage in numbers. Inside Brookdale Police Headquarters, the atmosphere was tense enough to suffocate. Officers moved through hallways in uneasy silence while command staff gathered behind closed conference room doors under harsh fluorescent lights. Deputy Chief Elena Ramirez stood at the center of it all, reviewing reports with a face hardened by frustration. Across the long wooden table sat Police Chief Warren Keller, a gray-haired veteran who looked exhausted beyond words. He rubbed both hands across his face before finally speaking. "Tell me this footage is incomplete," he muttered quietly. Nobody answered, because everybody in that room had already watched the full video. Several times. The evidence was undeniable. Daniel Hargrove had escalated the confrontation himself. Worse than that, he had done it publicly, recklessly, and without justification. Chief Keller stared at the frozen frame, paused on the conference room television. Isaiah Brooks, standing still, while Daniel grabbed his wrist. The image looked less like law enforcement and more like something broken deep inside the city itself. "How many complaints does Hargrove actually have?" Keller asked quietly. An uncomfortable silence filled the room again. Finally, a lieutenant cleared his throat nervously. "Officially," he asked, "or unofficially?" Those words changed everything, because suddenly the room no longer felt like a meeting about one incident. It felt like years of hidden truth beginning to crack open all at once. Meanwhile, across downtown Brookdale, crowds gathered outside City Hall holding candles and homemade signs beneath the warm Georgia night sky. Some people prayed quietly. Others sang old church hymns beneath the courthouse steps. Families brought folding chairs and stood together in silence while television cameras filmed the growing crowd from every angle. And standing above them on the City Hall balcony, Isaiah Brooks watched the city he loved wrestle with itself in real time. A young staff member approached carefully from behind him. "Sir," she said softly, "the governor's office called twice already." National media too. Isaiah nodded slowly, but kept his eyes fixed on the streets below. Hundreds of people now filled Jefferson Avenue carrying signs that read "Dignity matters and justice should not depend on status." Isaiah exhaled quietly. "Do you know what scares me most?" he asked without turning around. The staff member hesitated. "No, sir." Isaiah looked down toward the crowd gathered beneath the courthouse lights. "That people are shocked because it happened to the mayor," he replied softly. "They should be shocked it happens to anybody." Behind him, television screens inside nearby office buildings reflected the same footage over and over through dark glass windows. Daniel Hargrove's face. The crowd. The humiliation. The silence. And somewhere alone inside an empty locker room at police headquarters, Daniel himself sat staring at the same images replaying across his phone screen. The confidence that once protected him was gone now. In its place sat something colder. Fear. Because for the first time in his career, Daniel understood the badge could not shield him from what the entire country had already seen with its own eyes. And as protesters continued filling the streets outside City Hall, another realization settled heavily across Brookdale that night. The city was no longer asking whether there was a problem inside the police department. The city was finally asking how long everyone had pretended not to see it. The next morning, Brookdale woke beneath gray skies and a citywide tension that felt impossible to escape. Coffee shops opened early, but conversations stayed hushed. People stared at television screens mounted above counters instead of checking their phones. Everywhere you looked, the same footage continued playing. The same questions continued growing louder. And for the first time in decades, trust inside Brookdale felt cracked wide open for everyone to see. Outside police headquarters, reporters crowded the front entrance before sunrise while protesters gathered across the street carrying signs demanding reform. Some officers entering the building kept their heads down beneath the flashing camera lights. Others looked visibly angry, frustrated that one incident had suddenly turned the entire department into a national headline. But inside the building, the mood was even worse. Officer Daniel Hargrove sat alone in an interrogation room usually reserved for suspects and internal investigations. The fluorescent lights above him buzzed softly while untouched coffee cooled beside his folded hands. His uniform looked wrinkled now, smaller somehow. Across the metal table sat two internal affairs investigators reviewing footage frame by frame on a laptop screen. Neither man looked interested in protecting him anymore. One investigator finally closed the computer slowly. "Daniel," he said quietly, "this is not looking good." Daniel leaned back heavily, exhaustion replacing the arrogance that once defined him. "I followed procedure," he muttered for what felt like the 100th time. The older investigator stared at him carefully. "You keep saying procedure like it explains intent." Daniel looked away immediately, because deep down, he already understood something painful. Procedures could explain actions. They could not explain assumptions. Outside the interrogation room window, officers moved silently through the hallway, pretending not to stare. Some recognized Daniel as the same man they once admired for his confidence and aggression on the streets. But now that confidence looked different. Smaller, meaner, harder to defend beneath public scrutiny. Meanwhile, across town inside Brookdale City Hall, Mayor Isaiah Brooks prepared for an emergency council meeting while dozens of advisors rushed through corridors carrying folders, reports, and legal documents. Yet despite the pressure surrounding him, Isaiah remained unusually quiet. He stood alone near the large window overlooking Jefferson Avenue where cleanup crews were already removing barricades left from the protests overnight. Deputy Chief Elena Ramirez entered the office carefully carrying another stack of complaint files. "These came in overnight," she said softly. Isaiah looked down at the folders covering her arms. "How many?" he asked. Elena hesitated. 37 new complaints since midnight." The room fell silent. 37 people who suddenly felt brave enough to speak because they had watched the mayor himself endure what they had experienced quietly for years. Isaiah slowly sat at the edge of his desk, rubbing tired hands across his face. "Imagine how many never filed anything at all," he said quietly. Elena lowered her eyes because she knew he was right. A city employee knocked hurriedly before stepping inside. "Sir," he said nervously, "the press conference starts in 20 minutes. National networks are here." Isaiah nodded once. But before standing, he glanced again toward the growing stack of complaints spread across his office desk. Different names, different neighborhoods, different years. Yet somehow every story carried the same feeling beneath the surface. Fear, humiliation, silence. Back at police headquarters, Daniel finally received the news he feared most. Chief Warren Keller entered the interrogation room, personally, holding a thin manila envelope in his hand. The chief looked older than he had the night before, tired in a way sleep could not fix. He placed the envelope gently on the table between them. Pending full investigation, Keller said quietly, "You are being suspended effective immediately." Daniel's face drained of color. For several seconds he could not even speak. The room felt unbearably still beneath the humming fluorescent lights. "You are throwing me away because the mayor got embarrassed?" Daniel finally whispered bitterly. Chief Keller looked at him with something close to disappointment. "No," he answered softly. "You are finally facing consequences because too many other people were embarrassed before him." Those words lingered heavily in the silence between them. Because for the first time in his career, Daniel Hargrove realized the city was no longer looking at him like a protector. They were looking at him like proof of a problem they could no longer ignore. Rain began falling over Brookdale just before noon, soft at first, then steady enough to blur the courthouse windows and darken the streets below City Hall. Yet even the weather could not slow the crowds gathering outside. Protesters stood shoulder to shoulder beneath umbrellas and homemade signs while television crews continued broadcasting live from the sidewalks. The city had entered its fourth straight day of nonstop national attention, and tension inside Brookdale felt stretched to its breaking point. Inside the council chamber on the third floor of City Hall, every seat was filled. Reporters lined the walls. Community leaders sat beside ministers, activists, business owners, and exhausted residents who simply wanted answers. At the center of the room sat Mayor Isaiah Brooks beneath the city seal mounted high against polished oak paneling. His expression looked calm, but the exhaustion behind his eyes told a different story. Beside him sat Deputy Chief Elena Ramirez along with members of the Civilian Oversight Board reviewing stacks of newly reopened misconduct files tied to Officer Daniel Hargrove and several other officers. The room carried the heavy silence of people realizing the problem was much larger than one man. Councilwoman Denise Harper leaned toward her microphone carefully. "Mr. Mayor," she began, "the public wants to know how deep this goes." Isaiah folded his hands slowly before answering. "Deep enough that people stopped believing the system would protect them," he said quietly. Across the room, several residents nodded immediately. One elderly pastor closed his eyes and whispered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. Another woman wiped tears from her face while clutching a photograph against her chest. The city was no longer discussing policy. They were discussing pain that had been buried for years. Then the chamber doors suddenly opened again. Every head turned. Chief Warren Keller walked inside, carrying another thick folder beneath one arm. His face looked pale from sleepless nights and nonstop pressure from both the public and state officials. He approached the council table slowly before placing the folder in front of Isaiah. "Additional internal affairs findings," Keller announced quietly. Several complaints previously marked unresolved contained missing body camera footage. Murmurs spread instantly across the chamber. Reporters scribbled furiously while cameras zoomed tighter toward the table. Elena Ramirez opened the folder carefully, her expression hardening page by page. Witness statements, traffic stop reports, missing evidence logs. The deeper she read, the quieter the room became. Finally, she looked up toward Keller. "How was this allowed to continue?" she asked softly. Keller lowered his eyes. "Because too many people convinced themselves silence was easier than accountability." Those words lingered heavily across the chamber. Isaiah leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at the evidence spread before him. Every page represented somebody whose voice had been ignored. Somebody who went home feeling smaller after an encounter with authority meant to protect them. Outside the courthouse windows, thunder rolled faintly across the Georgia sky, while protesters continued standing in the rain below. Then, from the back row of the chamber, a young woman slowly stood up. She looked nervous, holding a folded paper tightly in trembling hands. "My name is Alicia Monroe," she said quietly into the silence. 3 years ago, Officer Hargrove stopped my brother walking home from work." The room became completely still. Alicia swallowed hard before continuing. "My brother filed a complaint after that night. Nobody ever called us back. Her voice cracked slightly, but she kept going. 2 months later, he stopped trusting police entirely. Last year, he moved away because he said Brookdale no longer felt like home. Isaiah listened silently as the woman wiped tears from her cheeks. Around the chamber, people lowered their eyes in quiet shame. Because suddenly this was no longer about headlines or politics or one viral video. It was about trust destroyed slowly over years until entire communities stopped believing justice belonged to them too. Isaiah finally stood from his chair beneath the soft hum of courthouse lights. The room watched him carefully as rain continued striking the windows behind him. "This city cannot heal by pretending these stories are isolated incidents," he said calmly. "Healing begins the moment truth becomes more important than protecting power." Outside, thunder echoed again across Brookdale while crowds beneath umbrellas listened through speakers placed on the courthouse steps. And somewhere inside police headquarters, Daniel Hargrove sat alone staring at the same rain falling against a small interrogation room window, realizing the storm outside the city had finally become a storm inside his own life. 3 weeks later, the streets of Brookdale looked calmer on the surface, but the city itself had changed forever. The television trucks were mostly gone now. Protest signs no longer crowded every corner outside City Hall. Rain had washed away the chalk messages written across courthouse sidewalks. Yet something deeper still lingered in the air. People walked differently. They watched differently. They spoke differently. Because once truth is seen clearly, it becomes impossible to pretend blindness ever felt innocent. Inside the packed Brookdale Civic Auditorium, hundreds of residents filled the seats beneath warm golden lights for the first public accountability hearing in the city's history. Ministers sat beside college students. Retired veterans sat beside young mothers holding children in their laps. Police officers in uniform lined the walls quietly, while reporters prepared cameras near the back of the room. At the center of the stage stood a single wooden podium beneath the city seal, and behind it stood Mayor Isaiah Brooks. He looked tired, older somehow than he had just weeks earlier, but his voice remained calm and steady as he addressed the crowd. "Tonight is not about revenge," he began softly. "Tonight is about honesty." The room fell completely silent. Isaiah glanced toward the front row where several families sat clutching folders filled with old complaint records finally reopened after years of silence. Some held photographs. Others simply held each other's hands. For too long, Isaiah continued, people believed dignity depended on status. They believed some voices mattered more than others. But justice cannot survive in a city where fear decides who deserves respect. Applause spread slowly across the auditorium. Not loud or celebratory. Heavy. Emotional. Like people finally allowing themselves to breathe after carrying something painful for years. Near the side entrance, Deputy Chief Elena Ramirez watched quietly beside Police Chief Warren Keller. Both understood the hearing represented more than politics. It represented a turning point Brookdale could never walk back from. New oversight policies had already been approved. Independent review boards established. Mandatory body camera protections expanded. Officers with unresolved misconduct complaints placed under investigation. Change had finally begun, but everybody in that room knew trust would take far longer to rebuild than policy ever could. Then Isaiah paused and looked toward the very back of the auditorium, where a familiar figure sat alone beneath the dim lights. Officer Daniel Hargrove, no longer wearing a uniform. No badge clipped to his chest. No authority surrounding him. Just a man sitting silently among the same public he once believed he controlled. Some people in the crowd noticed him immediately. A few whispers spread through nearby rows. But Isaiah simply looked at him calmly before continuing. "Accountability is not humiliation," Isaiah said quietly. "True accountability is when a person is finally forced to see the pain they refuse to recognize in others." Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor. For the first time in his life, there was nowhere left to hide behind procedure, excuses, or authority. Only consequences. Only reflection. Only truth. Outside the auditorium, church bells echoed softly through downtown Brookdale, while evening sunlight broke through clouds for the first time all day. Children laughed near the courthouse fountain. Families walked sidewalks that once felt heavy with tension. The city was still healing, but healing had finally begun. As the hearing came to a close, Isaiah stepped away from the podium and looked across the crowd one final time. A badge should never make someone feel smaller, he said softly. And power means nothing if it cannot protect the dignity of the people standing in front of you. The room rose into quiet applause as cameras continued recording every moment. But the most powerful part of the night was not the headlines that would follow or the political speeches that would dominate television tomorrow. It was the simple fact that an entire city had finally stopped pretending silence was justice. And somewhere deep inside Brookdale, people who once felt invisible began believing their voices mattered too. Because in the end, the man who thought he was protecting the law discovered something far greater than authority. He discovered that real justice does not begin when powerful people are respected. Real justice begins when ordinary people are finally treated like human beings.